In this video, I'm going to be talking you through my PC build. My budget was £650 sterling, which is currently, in September 2020, about €710 or 840 US dollars. My aim was to create a slick and robust all-round machine. I don't do gaming, but I just wanted good overall computing power and graphical performance. I've based my build on the AMD Ryzen 7 2700X processor with 8 cores, 16 threads and a 3.7 GHz clock speed. I've mated it to a B450M-A motherboard from the Asus Prime range, and I'm using the stock AMD cooler assembly, the Wraith Prism. I'm using 16GB of RAM. I've selected the 3200 GHz version from the Corsair Vengeance range. For graphics, I've gone for the lower to middle of the range Nvidia GeForce GTX 1650, specifically the Asus Phoenix card with 4GB memory. For storage, I've gone dual drive. I have an M2 form factor solid state boot drive with 250GB capacity. Specifically, I'm using the Western Digital Blue SATA format stick. Bulk storage is courtesy of a 1TB Seagate hard disk drive. My power supply is a 650 watt, 80 plus bronze rated non-modular unit from Be Quiet. To finish, I'm installing a wireless card, a DVD rewritable drive and a multi-card reader. The case I'm using is this, the Focus G Mini from Fractal Design. It's a micro ATX case with an acrylic side panel and 2 front-mounted LED lit fans behind this attractive black grille. This is my first PC build and I'm going to talk you through it. I'm not pretending to be any sort of expert, this is simply an explanation of how I chose to do it. Hopefully you will find it useful or, at the very least, interesting. The first thing I did was to install the power supply unit into the case. For my build, the location was at the bottom of the chassis. It fits straight in and is secured by 4 screws. It really is self-explanatory. Just be mindful of the fan on your power supply and make sure that it isn't obstructed. My case has a grill on the base just beneath where the power supply sits. Next, I started preparing the motherboard. Your motherboard will come with an I/O shield, behind which the various ports sit. This can be installed into your case by simply clicking it into place. Your case should be supplied with various fittings. You need to find your motherboard standoffs, which need to be screwed into the case in locations appropriate to your motherboard. The ATX standards prescribe exact dimensions for where these are located, but your motherboard might not use all of the available locations. You simply need to take a good look at your motherboard and correspond the screw hole locations to the positions on your case and install the standoffs accordingly. Next, we can get the processor ready for installation. Be careful when you're unboxing your CPU, try to avoid touching the top surface or the underside, which is covered by the tiny connecting pins. The processor is simple to install. Locate the locking lever and release it by lifting the arm up. Identify the orientation of the CPU. In the case of this AMD chip, it is identified by a tiny arrow symbol on both the CPU board and the socket on the motherboard. Holding the CPU by its edges, line it up with the socket and just let it drop into place. You should not have to force it. If force is required, it is in the wrong place. You will just end up bending the pins. Secure it into place by pushing the locking lever downwards until it clicks. This will require a small amount of force, so don't worry. Next, I installed the cooler. Obviously, you need thermal paste to create good thermal conductivity between the processor and the heatsink. The Wraith cooler comes with paste pre-installed, and I couldn't think of a good reason to interfere with it. Be careful not to touch either of the mating faces because you don't want to introduce any contaminants. The Wraith was installed by lining it up and hooking the anchors over the retaining brackets on the motherboard. The lever was then pushed down to put the assembly under tension and secure it into place. Next, I connected the fan header to the appropriate socket on the motherboard. If you are unsure of any socket locations on your motherboard, check the manual that came with it. It's better to get it right rather than to try and second guess. That said, modern standards ensure that the build process is relatively straightforward and foolproof. Next, I installed the RAM. This motherboard has 4 DIMM slots and I'm using 2 sticks of RAM. It is very important that you check in your motherboard's manual which slots to use. In the case of my motherboard, for a 2-stick setup I should use slots A2 and B2, which are coloured grey. Installing the RAM itself is easy, it will only go in one way. Make sure the lock tab is opened when you try and insert the stick and that it is closed when the stick is in situ. The RAM should go into place with a nice solid click so you know it's inserted properly. The last thing to add to the motherboard at this stage is the M2 form factor solid state drive. Your motherboard should be supplied with fittings for this. The tiny standoff needs to be screwed into the motherboard in one of the available positions. The positions are marked according to the nominal size of your M2 module. Mine, like most, is 2280. Once the standoff is installed, the M2 drive can be inserted into its socket and locked into place. The final step is to secure the module to the board using the tiny screw which screws into the standoff that you previously installed. Next, I decided to install my optical drive and card reader. Once you've opened up the bays on your case, removing any blanking plates, it's simply a case of sliding them into place and securing them using screws supplied with either your case or your drive. My tip is to tighten the screws progressively to ensure the drive lines up flush with the front of your case. My card reader, this Sabrent unit, is a 3.5-inch device. Therefore, I needed this 5.25-inch bay adapter from StarTech. Once the bay is mounted into the adapter, it's simply a case of mounting the whole assembly in the same way as the optical drive. Next to install was my mechanical hard drive. The case has 2 caddies that slide in and out of a rack. The hard drive is fitted into the caddies by aligning the anti-shock bushes and securing into place using 2 screws. The caddy is then simply slid into place in its mounting rack. Now things start to get serious. It's time to fit the motherboard assembly. With this being a micro ATX format board and case, it is a slightly tight fit, but it's simply a case of taking one's time. Obviously take care not to bend the board or put too much strain on the CPU and cooler assembly, though this should be locked into place quite tightly. To install the motherboard, you need to line up the I/O ports with the rear I/O shield, which is quite fiddly, and line up the holes on the motherboard with the standoffs that you secured to your case earlier. Once it's correctly in place, it should sit quite nicely without any unnecessary tension on it. When you're happy that it's in situ, you can start fastening the motherboard screws into the standoffs. Take your time and make sure you do all of them, although to be honest, it's not the end of the world if you miss one. And that's it, the build is starting to look like a computer now. There are 2 main power connectors that need to go into the motherboard. The main power supply, which in my case is this chunky 24-pin connector, and the smaller processor power supply, the socket for which will be located near to your CPU assembly. Now the motherboard is installed and connected, we can install the graphics card. Each card will be slightly different and you need to take your time to establish the exact installation requirements. My Asus Phoenix card does not require additional dedicated power, so that's one less thing to worry about. My card uses a single PCI Express X16 slot that uses 2 rear PCI panels. Some cases, like mine, allow the PCI blanking plates to be removed and reinstalled. Mine uses thumb screws. Some cases do not allow for reinstallation of the blanking plates because you have to break the plates off. If this is the case, be sure to remove the correct plates that align with your devices, otherwise you'll be left with a hole. To install the graphics card, just take your time to align the PCI connectors and the rear panel. The PCI connector should locate itself with a nice positive click. You'll know when it's correctly installed. If in doubt, it probably isn't. You can then secure the rear panel to your case. The final piece of hardware to install is my wireless module. This uses one of the smaller PCI X1 slots. I followed the same process as for my graphics card. Once it was in place, the antenna was screwed into the rear plate of the unit. The wireless card was slightly more fiddly because space was starting to get tight, but it was relatively straightforward. The final step of the physical phase of the build is to connect all of the many remaining internal cables. I suppose you could do this as your build progresses, but it made more sense for me personally to do it all at the end, so I could at least try and work out a strategy for routing all of the cables as neatly as possible. The downside of doing it this way is that some of the connectors are very fiddly, and as you add components to your build, the space inside your case becomes more limited and therefore harder to work in. Efficient cable management is essential to ensure your final build looks neat. There's no golden rule, you just need to take your time and think about what you're doing. My finished product is not perfect, but it's not too bad either. With so many connections crossing over one another, it's never going to be perfect, so just do your best. Be methodical and make sure you don't forget any connections. The hard disk drive required a power connection and a connection to one of the SATA ports on the motherboard. The DVD drive required the same. My card reader simply needed connecting to one of the available USB ports on the motherboard and required no additional power. Now to connect all of the cables from the case to the motherboard. I strongly recommend that you consult the motherboard's manual to make sure you get these right. It pays to take your time to avoid any errors. My case, which is fairly typical, had two fan headers to connect, a USB 2 and USB 3 connection for the front panel USB ports, and then the really fiddly bit. You will have numerous connectors for your front panel, which connect to things like the power button and the hard disk drive light. These are small, fiddly and very important. I had to use tweezers to help get the connectors onto the correct pins on the motherboard. There's a good argument for doing these before you install your graphics card and other PCI devices, because space is at a premium once these are in situ. And last but not least, I used the cable supplied with my Ryzen processor to connect the cooler to the RGB header on the motherboard. And that's it. To keep the cables tidy, I use zip ties to join them to one another and to secure them to the chassis of the case where possible. Most cases will have a cavity between the side panel and the motherboard mount in which to hide cables. The available depth will probably be quite limited, so just do what you can. For example, the connectors on the power supply cables are quite chunky and you might struggle to conceal them in this part of the case. As my power supply is non-modular, I had an excess of redundant power supply cables. I simply bundled them together as neatly as possible and stowed them on the base of the unit next to the power supply itself. All that's left to do is to refit the side panels onto your case and fire up your build. I'm very pleased to report that the time I spent ensuring everything was correctly installed paid dividends because everything was working correctly first time. Using the computer's BIOS, you can ensure that all your devices and drives are properly connected and correctly recognised. Once you've done this, it's just a case of getting your operating system installed, and then it's time to enjoy your new build. I hope you found this useful, or at the very least interesting. Thanks for watching. Please tell me in the comments what you like or don't like about my build. Let me know about your experiences of similar PC builds. My channel is fairly new, so I really appreciate your kind support by liking this video and subscribing to my channel. I have more content in the pipeline centred around tech, cars, motorcycles, documentaries and more. Thank you very much.